Hi, I'm Keith McCullough, and welcome back to Hedgeye TV for another real conversation with the world's renowned demographer, the one and only Neil Howe. Neil, good to see you.
Keith, great to see you again.
You know, there's a couple things going on that people probably want to talk about. They want to get Neil's opinion, so we're going to get into that. First, though, I wanted to, because we are going to talk about the fourth turning. That is what you authored, and maybe just for people that don't know, we'll give them maybe if you give them a quick overview of what that is, and then we'll get into some topics.
Well, the thesis of the fourth turning, which we laid out in books that came out in 1991, but more notably in 1997, is a theory that history moves through recurring patterns or cycles or rhythms, and that four stages, it's kind of like seasons of the year, and that the last season is the winter season, and that's the crisis era when institutions are torn down and rebuilt relatively rapidly, tremendous amount of political engagement going on, and that we're in one right now, right? We have one of these roughly every 80 or 90 years, starting from the 1680s in both the colonies and in well, really throughout Anglo-America. But we've had one, the American Revolution, the Civil War, the New Deal, the Great Depression, and we're back in one. What drives these rhythms is generational change. And obviously a lot of my work has been involved in talking about generations, defining them, understanding their dynamics. And crises aren't the only rhythms that we talk about historically. We also talk about rhythms of awakenings, right? And not reshaping the outer world of economics and politics, reshaping the inner world of culture, values, religion. These also follow an interesting pattern. They occur roughly halfway in between these great outer world crises. And all of this is interwoven with a distinct pattern of generational change. And I don't know, that's a little summary right there?
That's perfect. Now you get into the fun stuff, which is to put the Biden-Trump debate and all the political zeitgeist that goes alongside it. Where are we in that history?
Well, we're about halfway through. We think that this started 2008, 2009 with the GFC. It kind of got its second hit this year, but it's going to go on all the way until the year 2030. Maybe a little bit before, a little bit after. So it's a 22-year period, roughly the length of a generation. And we're getting deeper into it. The interesting thing about this election, and actually this is a trend that started in 2018, is the sudden, huge improvement, I should say improvement, but rise in civic participation, namely as measured by voter participation. In 2018, the by-election, that was the highest voter participation rate in a by-election going back 100 years, all the way until 1914.
Wow.
And this year, it looks as though this is the National Election Project. They've just calculated it. Think of this, Keith. Since 1972, the share of eligible voters who actually vote has only 3 times risen, just barely over 60%. This year, it's going to be something like 66.5%. That's the highest since 1900. That was when William McKinley ran for the second time against William Jennings Bryan. So this, in a way, you'd say is good news. I mean, come on. I mean, how many decades after decade do we complain Americans are apathetic, they're disengaged, they don't care about, what's the Well, say what you will about the Trump era. Love him or hate him. This guy has gotten Americans on both sides re-engaged with politics, right? They really care now what's going on. The bad news is kind of a good news, bad news story. The bad news is the reason they're re-engaged is because they think the other side is going to destroy America. So, a lot of it is driven by hatred and fear. I hate to say it. Negative motivations matter in politics. Some 9 out of 10 voters on both sides believe the other side will do permanent harm to America. Both sides overwhelmingly say that it matters in terms of policy. No more of this complaints about Tweedledum, Tweedledee. I mean, when Bush ran against Gore, you remember G.W. Bush ran against Gore in 2000, a huge share of voters said, this doesn't make any difference, right? This election doesn't matter. These people, Gore was running as a neoliberal, George Bush was running as a compassionate conservative. Do you remember that? And everyone just said, this doesn't matter, right? That has completely changed today. So you could say that that's actually a benefit. Voters are being given clear choices today. But one of the costs we see is this growing polarization in America, whereby everyone is increasingly aligned on policies that are diametrically opposed to each other. And you can see this most clearly. This was actually described in a book by an author named Bishop. This was called The Big Sort. It came out about 10 years ago. But he described how increasingly people are relocating with voters that think the same way.
Wow.
One fascinating thing is if you look at landslide counties, that is to say, counties in which the winning candidate beats the other candidate by at least 20 percentage points. That number is growing and growing and growing. Think of this, Keith. Back when Bill Clinton ran against George Bush Sr., that was 1992, only 38% of America's counties were landslide counties. In 2016, when Hillary Clinton ran against Trump, 60% of America's counties were landslide. And we think that in this current election, it probably is going to be up at around 65%. And one interesting thing you see too is happening is that the progressive side, the Democratic side, is getting bigger and bigger minorities on a smaller and bigger and bigger majorities on a smaller and smaller number of U.S. counties. So most counties, the majority is going for Republicans. So I have one good comparison to you. You'll enjoy this. When Bill Clinton won in 1992, he was a Democrat, and he got almost 50% of America's counties. Now, his popular majority was about 6%. It wasn't that much larger than we expect Biden's to be. We think Biden is going to come in at around 4.5% popular margin. So it was around 6.5%. He got almost half of America's counties. He got something like 1,500 counties in 3,100. Hillary Clinton, who won by 2 percentage points of the popular vote in 2016, she got only 490 counties. 490 out of 3,100. And we think that this year, even though Biden's going to get back to like 4.5%, he'll only have about 550 American counties.
Yeah, amazing.
Huge majorities in those counties.
Wow.
But this is the problem. I mean, this is the danger of what America faces right now.
Now that I'm assuming you're not counting the county of Canada, but it is amazing because I have Connecticut, Canada, a little alliteration for you there, and it is exactly the same thing. I mean, they all hate Trump. To drive around with a couple of Trump flags with like a big truck or something like that would look a little weird in Connecticut, and that's why the Trumpsters did it. But again, this I guess this engagement geographically that you're talking about, does that spark or does that provide a perpetual catalyst, more fire, more fuel to the fire into this fourth turning as it goes towards the year 2030 or not?
Well, it does, and one of the problems when you have two parties that are both competitive, they're both near 50%, they both have a chance of regaining power, and there are a number of great books on the history of this throughout American history, going back to the founders. But it turns out that these can be very unstable periods, meaning that if each party is mostly focused on gaining power, it's actually going to invite polarization because it wants to define its brand. It wants anything to give it an edge. And its first concern is getting power. Now, what typically happens is that and this particularly happens in a fourth turning, one party achieves dominance, often suddenly, right? And you have a big election. 1932 followed by 1936 would be a great example of that, where suddenly it's no longer competitive anymore. And then the minority party actually has a different incentive. It still needs to show results for its voters, right? But it no longer is competitive. So it's no longer it's rather sort of compliant, obsequious. It kind of goes along. It wants to do deals with the majority party so it can bring home the bacon to its voters. you saw that, Bob Michael, so we don't remember him today, but he was back in the 1980s, and he always used to say, well, this is what you expect of a minority party. It goes along to get along, but of course that damages its chances for ever regaining power, right? In other words, by always deferring to the majority party, you sort of give up your chance to reclaim. So it's kind of an all or nothing struggle. I think eventually one party is going to gain big dominance. Sometimes it's hard to know which party that's going to be. Sometimes we forget that before FDR won in 1932, Herbert Hoover won in 1928 with one of the largest popular margins in American history. So it can swing radically one way or the other, depending on which party is successful at getting the coalition. And obviously you need to do two things. You need to shore up your base. You need to reinforce your brand to your base. On the other hand, you have to be successful at reaching out to other constituencies, of putting together a coalition, which might involve parties, groups not like you. I think the Republicans are doing better at firing up their base, and Democrats are doing better at reaching out for a coalition. FDR did this famously, right? I mean, he had the Southern Democrats on board, which gave him that huge majority in Congress. But of course, in return, he had to leave Jim Crow and civil rights alone, right? He couldn't even support an anti-lynching law, which came up in the very late 1930s, and that was the bargain. And FDR said, we have huge things we want to do to rebuild our country. We're facing a crisis. We need to make deals.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, they were very successful at actually arranging that kind of coalition. The Republicans weren't, and the Republicans went into kind of a permanent congressional majority for many decades.
That's interesting. I mean, I've been citing this book called Rainbow's End recently, which leads you up to the crash of 1929, of course. So it's very interesting that you make that point about Hoover. And who would have thought, in 1928, 1929, when everyone was feeling, so sure that was the new era, or that was going to be the future.
I know.
That was the beginning of the absolute end. I mean, so when you put that in context of today, you get a lot of, obviously a lot of people with blue flags that are feeling much better, and a lot of people with red flags that are pissed off. Do you need to put it into a square into a round hole, or what do you need to do from the lessons of the prior turn? And how should people use that guide of history?
Well, again, I think obviously there are generational reasons to be very concerned if you're a Republican, namely that we do see a great deal of generational continuity. In other words, who you vote for and who you bond with in your early 20s, late teens, early 20s, when you first start to vote, definitely carries with you, right? So if you came of age as a young adult in the early to mid 1930s, you're a lifelong Democrat, right? I mean, even in the Great Society, you're still, you're still worshiping FDR. You're remembering him as an icon, and so you're always supporting unions. You're always supporting a lot of this stuff, and similarly for Xers who were born in the early 60s, came of age with Reagan. They continue to vote more Republican than people their age bracket even today. So this is the problem you deal with if you're a Republican. And I would say Republicans, I think, have to think outside the box at this point. They really have to think, how can we get our message to expand our coalition? They need a coalition. They can't just keep doubling down on people who's sort of reinforcing their core base. That's only going to work so far. It's only going to take them so far, and it's unlikely to be successful.
Well, with that, I mean, does it have to be a certain way? Does the turn have to be a turn in the political party? In other words, does the blue flag carry as far as it can into the very end? Literally, I mean, we have 8 or 9 years left on your timeline here. So, trying to think that through in terms of what happens next.
Typically, if you're going to have, if public policies is going to be changed, and you're going to make kind of sweeping reforms, and you're kind of reshape institutions, one party is going to have to take charge, right?
Yep.
That was easy for Lincoln during the Civil War. All the Democrats just left. They seceded, so suddenly the Republicans ran everything, right? That was easy. And obviously during the New Deal, and you saw the same thing through the American Revolution, one party achieves dominance and it reshapes things. And then of course you have different generational waves within that. I think a lot of the power for building up as opposed to tearing down comes from the rising adult generation, which is this case in the millennials. And back in the 1930s, it was the GI generation.
It's interesting. And how do we start to put, and I guess maybe some, just to get people up to speed on the gray, what do you call them, the gray beard or the gray person at this stage?
The gray champion.
The gray champion. The gray champion, and I think everybody would have a pretty good guess on who they think that was and who the next one would be, and Kamala Harris.
Right. Well, gray champions are made, they're not born. And very often these are people, they're always representing an older generation. They never belong to, the generation of young adults. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt was an example of a great champion for the GI generation. It's amazing how many of the great liberals that came out of that generation, including, Kennedy and LBJ, just worshipped him, as young adults. For the Civil War, it was Abraham Lincoln. He was the older leader who was very deft at compromising and coalition building. A lot of people don't understand Lincoln. He was very late, to actually endorse, emancipation and so on. He was very canny about it. He wanted all those border states, was in his hands first, right? Before really prosecuting the war. He was very good. And for, many candidates probably for the American Revolution, an obvious one that comes to mind who was just universally venerated even during his lifetime was George Washington. But these are definitely older leaders. They represent either the nomad or the prophet archetype, and they are made, they're not born, meaning these people are not necessarily people that you would have bet on before the crisis. They simply adapt and seize the opportunity. Abraham Lincoln was an extremely unlikely person. I mean, no one, just given his lowly origins and his gawkiness and his awkwardness and the almost flukish way in which he was elected in a four-way election in 1860, the fact that he got into power at all, but he used his opportunities masterfully. FDR the same way. FDR, very much unlike his third uncle, Teddy Roosevelt, was not particularly gifted. No one ever thought it. Everyone thought Teddy Roosevelt was, just this incredible dynamo. I mean, he was just an amazing person, even as a young adult. Writing books, just an incredible and charismatic person. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not, and there was a lot of misgivings even in 1932, despite the fact that how poorly Al Smith and the Democrats performed in 1928. A lot of misgivings about him taking the nomination, and he started slowly. He actually started as a moderate. He ran on a as you know, platform of balancing the budget. It was actually very cautious. But he gradually was able to work the system very deftly, particularly in the realm of building coalitions. Never wanted to get too far ahead of the public. I think he was very good at that, particularly with regard to entry into World War II. I mean, that was masterful because I think with the oil embargo against Japan, I think he knew where this was leading. I mean, it could only lead one place, right? There's no way Japan could survive with this stranglehold on its source of energy. But he sort of, I'm not responsible for this. And then, of course, the attack, we're outraged, right? I think it was deftly done. And he basically maneuvered public opinion to where he wanted. And he was, in the end, epically successful.
Mm-hmm. Now, and on the question of Kamala Harris, or when we start to think about females in history, I mean, obviously I can think of one in the UK in particular.
Well, I think she's a woman to watch. She definitely has charisma. Some would say an attitude. She can kind of take control of a room. I think that's clear. I think she displayed a little bit of that in her debate against Mike Pence, right? And again, we have to wait and see. The persona will appear in the context of events. Will they take advantage of the events? Without the events, you can't really achieve that. Bill Clinton used to complain, when he left the presidency, he wished there had been a crisis. He could have been such a great president. and well, he was a reasonably popular president. He sort of rode the tides of the 1990s, but nothing really happened in the 1990s, and nothing was going to happen, right? I mean, he basically sort of went along with, big government doesn't have to be that powerful. We're going to balance the budget. We're going to get rid of welfare, as you know. We're going to kind of ride the wave of sort of, this prosperity and the tech revolution. And he was never really he didn't have the opportunity to become what he would consider a great leader. So he was a little bit frustrated there. But I think the same way as you could say Teddy Roosevelt was, he wanted to do great things. It just wasn't, the moment wasn't right for him.
Yeah, I think that's something, at least when I think about markets, I think about a lot. It has nothing to do with like some government person trying to do something. It happens at a particular time when a certain move particularly matters. I mean, it's just...
There's an opportunity, and you seize it. It's a combination of opportunity and being able to seize it deftly, wisely, right. Practically.
Well, I think like people are quite attracted to your framework, obviously on generations, but once you go generations and genders and we start to, people start to say, wow, this really, he says something's turning. That sounds like, or it looks like it's turning. And that's, I think that's something that, I know you tighten it up, but also on the institutional point, I just want to make sure I got this question to you because you wrote about it today. This distrust and replacing of institutions, which is, polling. Like people they get upset about Trump, but Trump's upset about something that probably a lot of Americans are upset about. If they could have a better polling system, or hey, some actual polls that were accurate, they'd probably take that.
Yeah, the accuracy of the polls is a really interesting question. I mean, it turns out that the national polls were obviously somewhat overestimating for the Democrats, but within the margin of error. Going into election eve, Biden was favored by 7.2 percentage points. We expect that Biden will get about 4.5 margin. And by the way, if you don't believe me, if you don't think he's going to reach it, you can go and predict it and make money. So I'm just saying, there's a market actually for that.
Yeah.
You can bet on the margin. And right now it's about 50-50, actually slightly favoring over 4.5%. But here's my point. If he comes in at 4.5, that's going to be within 3 percentage points of 7.2. That's within the margin of error. And by the way, that's a pretty large margin. That is the largest margin since Obama in 2008. And going back before then, it's the largest since 1996, Bill Clinton over Bob Dole. So it's a reasonably large margin. Interestingly, Keith, it's the largest margin for someone running against an incumbent since Ronald Reagan in 1980, right? Popular margin. Of course, Reagan's was bigger, something like, it was over 9%. But so I don't think that one was off. Now, the states, the battleground states kind of went either way, but they generally came in kind of how we were calling them. I think where they really got it wrong, systematically wrong, and not within the margin of error, was all the down ticket decisions. There was a big fail for the Democrats. Everyone thought that they were more likely than not to retake the Senate. They've only gained a net 1 seat. They have two obviously up for grabs in Florida. They're going to be hard pressed to even take one of the, in Georgia. This is the sort of the second stage of the jungle primary, and then the regular election that's going to be, this is both on January 5th. So that's in Georgia. They'll be lucky to take even one of those. So they're almost surely not going to take back the Senate. And a big fail in the House, right? They actually have lost, at least so far, a net 5 seats. I think 3 flipped in favor of the Democrats, 8 flipped in favor of the Republicans, and they haven't done very well in the state and local, state elections either, which is actually a shame for them because next year will be all the redistricting, right? The 2020 census is going to come out. So that's an all-important year to have you winning the state legislatures. They didn't do as well as they liked. What went wrong? And I recently, just this morning actually, did a big long piece on that, and we go through the various reasons. One of them, I think, is obviously the in-person campaigning by Trump. He was, Democrats said it was foolish. But Trump partisans thought it was, pretty gutsy, pretty brave. And the Trump team went out house to house, even personally, even in the midst of the pandemic. And there's no question that in-person beats online, Keith, every time. You know what I mean? I mean, you get out and you start mixing with the folks, it definitely makes a difference. And Trump was a dynamo in the last few days before the election. I think the second one was the Biden and the head team did not sufficiently control what I would call their social and cultural left. And I'm talking about stuff like, defund the police and sort of the spirit of open borders, systemic racism, a lot of this stuff. And as a result, a lot of moderates running in the House have been complaining. I mean, just go on the New York Times, Washington Post, you can see these people complaining. Now that the election's over, I mean, they're speaking their mind about this stuff. What, get rid of fracking? In Pennsylvania, are you joking? And that's never going to happen anyway. So why are you doing? You're just losing my district, right? So these are, in other words, ideological signpost issues, which are not terribly practical, which galvanize your really core base, but lose you all your marginal districts, right? And so there's going to be tremendous tension, I think, within the Democratic Party over this, and particularly the whole issue of race and crime. We know that was hugely motivating for voters this year. I think for 67% of voters, they said that was a major issue. For about 20%, it was the most important issue. There was switching either way, but I think most of them was, moderate Democrats switching and voting Republican rather than the other way around. So this is something that the Democrats will have to deal with. There's a great deal more, because they are more of a coalitional party, there's a great deal of more tension. There's also a great deal of more age tension, right? They've got a very activated millennial cadre, and they've got this, pretty solid, early wave boomer silent generation cadre, particularly of leaders. So anyway, that's going to be interesting to watch. And finally, the whole issue of the shy Trump voter. Remember, we've talked about that many times. I think that did show up a little bit. It's very interesting. If you, one person, this was a big pollster at USC, actually asked a question. If you ask people, who are all my friends going to vote for? You get a more accurate poll than asking, who are you going to vote for, right? And, if you would ask that question, if you most of these polls, you say, who am I going to vote for? 10% for Biden. If you would ask, who are all my friends and the people I know going to vote for? It would have been much more like 5 or 6 for Biden, which is much more close to the, right? In other words, deflect it. I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do, but let me just talk about, the people around me, right? And interestingly, though, I think where we've gotten the shy Trump voter wrong is that we have laid too much emphasis on Trump. Actually, I think it's just a shy Republican voter phenomenon. And interestingly enough, in the data that I'm looking at, it actually, the shyness goes up by income and education level. In other words, higher income, highly educated Republicans, particularly moderates, are the most shy about talking about, right? They're the most fearful of, political discussion, impacts on their job, their career, their friends. And this is not the image we get. In other words, these are not necessarily the Trump voters. These would be more like the people voting for Susan Collins in Maine, And by the way, we had an epic fail on that, right? I mean, we underestimated her vote by more than 10 percentage points. A moderate, totally respectable, right? Been in the Senate for God knows how long, right? Well, she won. That was not expected. And so I think that's an issue as well.
Well, all these things, I mean, they're so interwoven, and that's why so many people are so interested in, again, your framework. But I'm trying to get to I don't know how the hell you get to the end of the fourth turning, and I'm certainly excited for you to give us, if you want to see, winter is coming, they get it, it sounds bad, things are bad, it looked really bad, but now you get a lot of people that think it's really good and other people that think it's really bad, and there's a brokenness to the institutions. Like, to me, and it's interesting. I mean, I'm obviously my own piece of work here, and I'm not Republican or Democrat, but I just tweet something really simple. Like, you guys are all crazy. If you're all left and you're all right and you have to push either side, for a math guy, that just doesn't compute. And I get so much feedback on that, Neil. I know I'm a Gen X guy, I got my own problems. But to me, I'm speaking to the solution to the brokenness, which is partisanship. And that, to me, I'm wondering if I'm right or if I'm wrong, or if it's just going to continue to be partisan and you can't really speak that way out in public unless you're as dumb enough as I am to do it.
I think actually when I talk to people and, talk to clients and so on, there is widespread acknowledgement that large institutions in America are broken, simply in their effectiveness and their cost. I mean, a good example is higher education, broken. Our healthcare system, that's what, 18.7% of GDP, completely broken. I mean, if we measured, productivity in terms of better health against rising costs, that's like negative productivity growth, right, over the past 30 years.
Yeah.
But no one questions it. Everyone allows the providers to spend, other people's money, right? And that's fine. And, we can't seem to get our hands on it, right? I think antitrust in America is broken. I think regulation of social media is broken. And I think it's very hard for two relatively individualist generations, namely Gen Xers and Boomers, to kind of back away from their lifelong preoccupation from liberating us, from government, from the culture, from tradition, and letting everyone go their own way, to come to grips with what are essentially systemic institutional failures. We see that very strongly, by the way. I think that's why there was such incredible pessimism about America's response to COVID-19, right? Which COVID-19, I think, exposed everything dysfunctional about our culture, libertarian culture, our political system, our federal political system where there's no national authority, and fascinating, Keith, is that older generations were the ones mainly supporting, protect my rights, I don't have to go outside without a mask, these are the ones most endangered, these are the ones most dying, and they're least likely to have a job that requires their presence, right? So they would suffer least and benefit more by actually a strict enforcement policy that could get this under control. Millennials, who are least likely to die, most likely to be unemployed, in a shutdown, are most in favor of a systematic, nationally led policy. And this inversion of age bracket responses to COVID has fascinated me. And I see it in a lot of other areas of American life, where you see the younger generation actually more in favor of something, with authority, that's systemic, that's top down, that actually takes all what you've learned around the world and actually applies it thoroughly for a system-wide solution.
That's like that's what I mean. We have if we're going, winter is coming and the bad shit's gonna happen. I mean, why is it that so many people that's the millennial generation asking for that? My generation and the generation older than I, they think that the answer to all this is the Fed, government spending, more government. The government's here. Like, I mean, this is, to me, this is bananas. Like, it makes you kind of, I guess it brings you back to or at least brings me back to the Benjamin Franklin saying, like, how much liberty are we willing to give up to give us some short-term financial security? And to me, Okay, that's like a lot of that's in the stock market, for example, is one way where you could see kind of, wow, we fixed it. We fixed it using the broken institutions.
Well, as I recall, back in the late 60s, it was boomers who insisted if it feels good, do it.
Yeah.
And there you've got the Fed policy. There you got stimulus, right? Let's don't think about tomorrow. I remember that from the late 60s as well. So, you know, that's where we are today. These people are now in charge.
Yeah.
And so where is this going to come out? You know, what are we looking at? What are some of the long-term shifts we're going to see? You've talked about one of them, Keith, in a lot of your recent shows, and that's inflation pressure. You know, as modern monetary theory, I think, becomes de facto accepted by most of the world's advanced economies. You know, if real rates of interest are negative, why, you'd just be stupid not to just borrow as much as you want. Just give it to everyone who needs it, right? I mean, that would just be perverse, right? So we're going to engage in this. And I think that right now, I would not want to be, at least on a systematic or long-term basis, heavily invested in nominal assets right now, right? I mean, that would just be my, you know, overall feeling about that, because I think the inflation that comes out of monetary theory, first of all, you know, the Fed guarantees it's not going to happen, and they're going to keep interest rates low until, I don't know, for the next 24 months. But of course, once the Fed starts having to chase inflation expectations upward, that's when you're going to get the huge bond crash, right?
Yeah.
And so you've got to prepare for that. I think and it's going to be regarded, if inflation does happen, it won't even be regarded as a bug. It'll be a feature, because that way we take wealth away from the creditors, give it all to the debtors. You know, we tip our economy away from the old, give a little bit of advantage to the young. So I think in many ways, this is sort of a win-win. I think policy always moves in the default direction of where there seems to be a lot more benefits than penalties. I think we are going to move that way. I think in foreign policy, we're going to move toward more engagement abroad. I mean, that's Biden's, you know, leitmotif, right? We're going to be closer to our allies. We're going to engage. We're going to re-solidify our alliances. Well, I think that there are issues that are going to come out of that. You know, increasing share of Americans think that we have interest at stake in the Western Pacific. And I think those are going to come out as well. I think that's kind of the foreign policy danger of which might rise rapidly to the fore in the fourth turning. We've seen it in every other fourth turning. And by the way, the willingness of Americans to actually engage in conflict in defensive alliances over the past 4 or 5 years has been rising. I mean, I watch these opinion polls strongly. Interestingly, on many of these flashpoints, Democrats are more willing to actually engage in conflict now than Republicans. This is a complete turnaround, right? Mm-hmm. So the Republicans are increasingly becoming the party of isolationists. And the Democrats are becoming the party of global engagement. And if necessary, yeah, we're going to, enforce our will. This, again, reminds you a lot, does it not, of the 1930s. I think another issue we're going to see, and I know that a lot has been written on it, Keith, is secession or nullification. I think it's fair to say that many people who voted for Trump, many people who live in the red zone, will not accept this presidency. I mean, he's sort of illegitimate. They'll probably go along with it so long as there's no big issue that rubs them the wrong way. But I think it's going to be very interesting if you have some sort of tax policy. Could be income tax, corporation tax, inheritance tax. Could be a regulatory ruling. I don't know, either on energy or something involving, the culture, right? And you could suddenly have a movement of governors, of people saying, we're just not going to enforce that. Now, This used to be called nullification. It's come up repeatedly in American history. It actually, Jefferson and Madison actually first raised it with the Alien and Sedition Acts. This goes way back in the late 1790s. And then, of course, Calhoun raised it with regard to Southern state rights. But anyway, it's repeatedly been invoked. And every time it's invoked, it always raises that specter. Well, you going to let that stand? Or are you going to go in and challenge it? Can you really let that stand? If a governor just says, no, that particular rule, we're just not going to, we're not going to pay those tax revenues. Well, that kind of dares the blue zone, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. And a blue zone that feels vulnerable might say, no, we're going to enforce it. We can't back down on this one. Of course, that gives you your another crisis scenario. I think there are a lot of places this could go, Keith, and you kind of keep, it's sort of like three-dimensional chess. You kind of keep all of those things happening, right? All of those eventualities possibly even playing out at the same time.
Yeah, and then it all breaks. That's what people want. Like this to me, and because we're, at least I think, in my own little mind, sometimes tries to get this to what party wins. The whole bloody thing fails is basically what the fourth turning is institutionally. And to me, yes. Like and by the way, if you have questions, please ask them. Some of the questions, the one that just moved to number one in the queue, literally nails this right on the head. I mean, and I agree with it in terms of this word socialism, because socialism has been a bipartisan policy. Let's be very clear on that. From a market perspective, absolutely. Joining the Treasury with the Fed and spending trillions at a time and debating whether or not it should be an extra $500 billion, that's socialism. I mean, it's not, there's no conservatism to that. And this question from Alex is you've said that socialism is in part the millennial mindset. Will this be something that fails in the long term? Could that be the fourth turning?
Everything fails in the long term. I mean, everything fails in the long term, because what happens is, even if it works, you need to adjust it, right? The society will enter a new mood, a new phase. People will want different things. Yeah. You'll have a problem of excess. You'll overshoot. But I do say that in fourth turnings, government always grows stronger. And I mean much stronger. That's just a
into it or coming. I thought coming out of it, the government gets eviscerated. No?
Well, no. Coming out of it, it remains strong through what we call the first turning, right? But it no longer is in crisis. It just very strong institutions. The generation that fought the crisis built all these strong institutions, and then they're just beginning to enter midlife, right, and taking over leadership of them. So that would be, for instance, the American high, right? The late 40s, the presidencies of Truman and Eisenhower and John Kennedy. Institutions very strong. I mean, unions, big corporations. When Kennedy thought that the steel makers were raising their prices too much, he just got on the phone, right? Yeah, hey, take those prices down. And so the GIs had this very top-down mentality when it came to running the economy. We were a very engaged people. Most people were all civically engaged. There was a tremendous optimism and trust in America back then. And of course, big institutions thrived off that, and they used it. We made huge strides in the 1950s, little acknowledged today, not just in terms of infrastructure, miracle vaccines, all the research that led to everything from the moon launch to transistors, but also in things like civil rights. Tremendous migration of African Americans out of the South, for example. We had huge equalizing trends in income and wealth in the late 40s, 1950s, throughout most of the 1960s even. Well, that came to an end, right? We entered our next turning. That was the second turning. That's an awakening. And, that's kind of when, hell breaks loose and all those trends begin to turn a different direction. That becomes a turning away from trust, obviously, and a turning toward individualism. And awakenings have an interesting, unity of their own if you go. And the rising generation during an awakening is what we call a prophet archetype. Most recently, it was boomers. Mm-hmm. But we had, earlier generations like that, the missionary generation born just after the Civil War, the transcendental generation born just after the American Revolution. This was the generation of Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln and Emerson and Thoreau and all those young adults who founded, communes and feminist clubs all over America. I mean, they were an incredibly powerful generation in the culture, just as the prophet archetype always is.
All right, that's a jammed answer to a loaded question. Here's another one. Is the fourth turning a global event, or will this one be the first one that's global?
That's an excellent question, and actually, in a book I'm doing right now, but I should mention that, by the way.
I was gonna ask you, but now you're gonna say it. Just say it.
No. I got a book coming out, but that's actually one thing we're going to talk a lot more about. A lot of these trends we see today are global, meaning there's a lot of coincidence today between generational trends worldwide. And we've seen this ever since the Great Depression and World War II, where we saw a big civic generation come of age. Whether it was the Long March generation in China, the independence generation in India, obviously everyone who fought in World War II. And then since then, we've seen very similar archetypes. They may be separated a little bit in terms of age and birth years, but we saw a war child generation coming out of the Depression and World War II. We definitely saw a global boomer generation making itself known in 1968, whether it's in Germany or Paris. And we had even a global Generation X, very drawn to urban life, markets, hip hop. Which made itself known in the 1990s. The Germans call this the Berlin generation for obvious reasons with reunification. And now we're seeing evidence of a global millennial generation. I'll tell you something very interesting. There's some fascinating work now done by Roberta Foa, who's in charge of the Cambridge Center for Democracy, as well as Yasha Monk, who works at Johns Hopkins. And they've been pointing out that faith in democracy, trust in democracy, confidence in democracy is dropping in all of these areas of the world, but it's dropping most rapidly among young adults. That is to say, global millennials. They are disproportionately drawn to populism of the right and left, and they're disproportionately happier whenever populism wins. And this is actually news to a lot of people who think that millennials just want, very sort of moderate, antiseptic technocrats. They don't. And so you see this in Southern Europe. You see it, I think, most remarkably in Southern Asia, whether you're looking at India, Narendra Modi, or Burma, or, obviously China, where you see an increasing number of the rising generation want to join the Communist Party and revering, Uncle Xi. You see it, Abe Shinzo. You see it in the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte. This is a global movement. We see it now, and obviously in Latin America, Keith. We've talked a lot about, AMLO and Jair Bolsonaro. Jair Bolsonaro, I think, wants to do everything that Trump ever did. He even got coronavirus, right? Boy. They're imitating everything that each other does. And so this is global now, right? These trends are global. And people pay too much attention to right versus left. Actually, I think that's actually less operative. The point is, it's not liberal particularly, and it's not procedurally democratic. This is a generation that wants to galvanize, mobilize, and make big changes in a system that they believe isn't working for their future.
This is, and this, I think this lends itself to this next question, which from Karen, she calls it a multifaceted question because it is, and it's using really COVID as the catalyst. Like COVID was our first global, of the modern era, obviously pandemic, but crisis, legitimate crisis. Some kind of I've heard a lot of our institutional clients have often, because they're constantly trying to paint what's happening in the market as that's going to be the next 3 to 5 years. We just came out of World War II. So did you see what stocks did after that? But that's not the question. I'm just ranting a bit. This is, do you think COVID and the fallout is the actual crisis, or do you think there are more events yet to come that we don't know that will spur an even more severe crisis globally?
Well, what typically happens is crisis leads to crisis. So in other words, if crisis accentuates the dysfunction, you increase the likelihood of a next crisis. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And typically,
I'm a fractal guy, man. That's how it goes. It's not like you got similar sets. They cause each other to happen.
Right.
I'm not some linear guy. I get it.
And it's growing rapidity. It's kind of like a chain reaction. And what happens is that all these individual crises gradually combine into one single huge battle or contest.
Kaboom.
And you have to win that one, right? And then when that gets solved, all the other questions get solved. I mean, a great example, Keith, is World War II eventually, which is an enormous global war. But the solution of World War II, you notice, involved everything from the United Nations to the World Bank to the IMF to Bretton Woods. It was going to solve all of the problems of the 1930s, not just fascism, but predatory trade policies. And it was going to solve all of our monetary issues. It was going to solve, global labor problem. In other words, everything what came down to this one incredible battle that had to be won. And that increasing focusing of energy as fourth turnings go on from a lot of disparate causes is very typical. Again, go back through other crises and you see a similar dynamic.
Well, this is what gets in. We're getting closer to out of time here, but at least I'm getting to kind of the wood here. At least I think I'm getting down to the wood, which is, Trumpism. And a lot of people over the years have, to your point, you've made this point, and that's why I believe this to be true. People don't understand that it's not about Trump. It's something much larger than Trump. So it's indefinitely going to be called Trumpism. Does it have to be Trumpism, or what is here's a question from Sergey, what is the likely course of Trumpism and its future, and can it be something else that it always was?
Well, this is going to be, I think, more interesting. You have two very interesting things happening now in politics within each party, right? So we've already talked a little bit about the tensions within the Democratic Party between, a very woke, in general, a younger left and a more moderate center, right? Which is actually a larger spread in the Democratic Party being more of a coalitional party than it is with Trump. I think in the Republicans right now. I think the issue for Trump is that they have two sets of leaders, right? I mean, on the one hand, they've got, Marco Rubio and Nikki Haley and a bunch of people you could say, who are going to kind of be this more moderate, maybe kind of, I don't know, Tory socialist or something party, which is going to be, try to make a lot more inroads into moderate Democrats, right? It's clear what their strategy would be. In other words, we can retain Trump, but we can go and actually get that coalition, which the Biden coalition can't get. That's their strategy. And on the other hand, you're going to have a younger group of people who will exactly go out. This is the Tom Cottons and the Ted Cruzes and maybe, Josh Hawley and a number of these senators. And they're going to go out and they're going to try to take the mantle of the core Trump and amp it up, right? And I think they will be fairly successful. I actually don't think that Trump will be a viable, that Trump himself will remain a viable candidate. And the reason is because if you look at people, if you poll even in Trump land, even though they love his cause, they're often very frustrated by who he is, right? I think even the most devoted Trump fans could say, we could have had a better, exponent of this, a better representative of this philosophy, right? And in fact, I think even from Trump's own point of view, he made just so many ridiculous mistakes. I mean, for instance, with COVID, that was his opportunity to sort of, right, become the authoritative leader that America would have wanted. Instead, he just completely whiffed and said, I'm not responsible. All these state governors are. I mean, even if you totally believed in Trump and everything about what that means, I just think it was a complete whiff. And on the stimulus, why didn't he do one better than the House? Why didn't he say, I'm in favor of a $4 trillion bailout, and I'm going to call it the Trump bail? I mean, he would have really but he would have had to have done that, way back in July. He couldn't do that 2 weeks before the election, right? But anyway, I thought he wasn't even tactically very good. That was my real complaint about Trump. He had a lot of opportunities to actually use events productively, and he just missed. I don't think he saw it.
So the future of Trumpism is going to be whatever that guy is going to be. He's going to probably be his own media company. By the way, he's going to be competing with this conversation.
Oh yeah, he'll be out there. He'll be on the radios. He'll be certainly a big TV star, and a lot of people will watch him. But I think as a viable political candidate, no. I think the nightmare for Republicans, of course, is if like a little bit like Teddy Roosevelt, right? In 1912, sort of running as another candidate and completely splitting the red zone vote, right? And that would be disaster. I mean, that would actually be a wonderful opportunity for true dominance by the Democrats. And we've had examples of that. I give you, again, the example of the Civil War. The Republicans would not have won that massive victory had not the Whigs completely split into Southern and Northern, had not the Democrats split between Northern and Southern halves. And then there was chaos, complete fragmentation of the other side, particularly over the issue of slavery, and that was an opportunity. And the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln made use of it, and as a result, they basically, ran the country for the next 70 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, people, maybe this is definitely my last question on this, because I certainly don't know the answer, but I struggle with it. And I'll just tell you personally, I struggle with it. I think a lot of people do that have, again, if I was something, I guess I'd be libertarian, I'd be conservative on, taxes, and I kind of like it as a company that has to pay lower taxes because we can hire more people. There's some pretty basic concepts that we have there that at least from my perspective, don't have to put me in a political box. But I have kids. I have 4 kids at home, right? I mean, I live in the raging blue state of Connecticut, and they're told every day, that this guy's bad and voting for Democrat is good. And my second oldest daughter, who was old enough to ask me the question on election day, she said, "Mom, who did you vote for?" So of course Laura voted for Biden. And then she asked me, she still didn't know that I don't vote. And she said, because I can't vote, I'm a Canadian green card holder. And she said, "Dad, who'd you vote for?" And I said, "For the Objective Party." And and Laura looked at me like, "Holy shit, man! Did you really just say that to our kids?" And I started laughing, of course. But is there a place? And this is my question. That's not a political statement. Is there a place in the fourth turning for the actual truth? I mean, the fact-based, data-driven truth that you and I wake up, God willing, 2 feet on the floor every day. Hedgeye, as an independent research provider, has always had that at the core of our mission. I don't believe any of these parties. I believe the data. Is there a spot for that, or am I being too KM about this, too utopian about this, and it just puts me squarely in the minority that I've always been in?
No, so I hate to give you a generational answer to your question. I'm going to talk for a second about Gen Xers. I find this is the Gen X frustration with ideology and partisanship in general. Xers are very pragmatic. I want to know the cause and the effect. Give me something that I can actually objectively look at and I can actually build something. My portfolio. How do I invest? How do I, what are the rules? What do I actually do to make something happen, right? And so I think you really have to, particularly in a fourth turning, differentiate between 2 realms. There's a realm of ideology in which what everyone believes is a self-created truth, right? In other words, it's kind of like, Christianity or any big religion. If everyone believes it, it kind of just makes its own truth, right? Because you kind of have to believe it, and you're right. You understand what I mean, right?
Yeah.
It's the same way with ideology. I mean, if everyone believes it, well, then that becomes a tool that you can use. You kind of have to go along with it in order to organize people and motivate them, and it sort of creates itself. But then you have another realm, which is the fact that you're either right or wrong when it comes to something technological, something with regard to a market bet. You may be right, you may be wrong. And I think effective leaders know how to operate in both realms. In other words, they know ideology is ideology. We need to kind of, pander that or encourage it. On the other hand, there's this realm. If I'm going to send, if I'm going to send, Patton into the Ardennes, or if I'm going to storm ashore at D-Day, or I'm going to decide, not to island hop, but do some other kind of strategy in World War II, or I'm going to decide to actually, hike taxes in 1937. That will have real world consequences independently of what anyone believes. And I think the secret in life, Keith, see, here we go. Boomer kind of giving an extra life advice. The secret in life is to keep those different realms apart. There's a realm where real things have real effects, and it doesn't matter what you think about it, right?
Yeah,
it's going to happen that way.
It's a good thing I didn't.
COVID-19 is a good example.
Yeah, it's a good thing I didn't start with my ideology as a Roman Catholic Irish guy. I mean, I didn't go with that. The ideology is absolutely not where I was. And that's the point that I was trying to make with Lucy, who's my daughter, I'm of the objective party, like I'm my own party. I mean, there's no party for me. I'm just trying to stay on the empirical path. And I do think a lot of people that I talk to about this that engage, and they have to be closer to your friend, or you never know, they'll just cancel you for life, right? I mean, and like I care. I mean, people cancel me all the time.
Wow.
But it's really like it's really an interesting conversation within the conversation that I often find myself having with political partisans.
I'm my own party that's spoken like a true Xer. And I'll tell you, come the revolution, we won't try to mobilize you. We'll just leave you alone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, I guess maybe that's why somebody probably gave me the COVID. I just got locked up for 10 days in my own house. And my wife, and by the way, as a final point, she was probably pretty happy about that too. So anyway, thank you very much. I mean, as always, you're giving us all an education, and I think that for me, the non-ideologue, that's what I was looking for. So thanks for spending the time. We certainly appreciate it.
This is a pleasure.
And good luck with your new book. Neil's next book is coming out in 2022, is it? Is it going to be?
Yeah, 2022. We expect I have to finish it by the end of next year, but we're already doing a lot of work on it. So
awesome. We're all looking forward to that. He's Neil Howe. I'm Keith McCullough. Thanks for joining us.